Dawn came on like a rumour, low cloud, pewter water, the sky scraped thin over the picket line off Okinawa. Out there, 16 miles from the main fleet, a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts stood guard, arrowheads pointed into the wind. Their job was simple on paper and murderous in practice. See the storm first, take the hit first, and buy time for everyone behind them. On this morning, the CIC watch called it before anyone else could feel it. The radar scope wasn't showing distant points anymore. It was filling. Snow, sailors called it, because the neat geometry of pips was dissolving into a blizzard of moving grain. The phones popped and hissed. Bearings rattled off like drumfire. Far to the north, a thick smear of returns coalesced into tracks, then multiplied. By 0600, the first Kikusui strike, floating chrysanthemum was in motion, hundreds of aircraft forming a layered blow, kamikazes threaded among escorts and decoys. If you'd watched the earlier campaigns, the Philippines Leyte, you might have told yourself you knew the pattern. Low approaches, sunline dives, last-second jinks, and a cruel fraction that always got through. But this time the geometry was different, even if the sailors didn't have the words yet. The difference was hiding in the nose of the shells that the gun crews were hoisting out of the magazines. The stenciling said, VT, variable time. It was a lie by design. There was nothing time set about what was about to happen. Inside those nose cones lived a miniature radar set that woke only after the shell left the barrel, listened for its own echo, and made a decision instantly, reliably about when to explode. That decision created what gunners would later describe in plain language, a wall of steel, not a single point of impact, but a sphere of fragments in the air at the exact moment an airplane crossed the wrong patch of sky. Near misses once the tragic arithmetic of anti-aircraft fire were about to be redefined as kills. At maximum practical range, 12,000 yards, the first black blossoms began to pepper the horizons. The shell flight times felt eternal at that distance. You aimed into the future and trusted physics to meet you halfway. Before VT, a burst 50 feet off the target was a shrug and a curse. With VT, 50 feet was inside the lethal bubble, and it showed. The first attackers didn't peel off dramatically. Many simply lost the coherence required to fly, wings torn ragged, engines holed, pilots slumped over dead at the controls, airframes that ceased to be airplanes. From the bridge wings you could watch it happen without the comfort of understanding. The sky was detonating on its own. Destroyers lived through scenes like this by the minute, not the hour. Every minute stacked decisions. Keep the bow pointed? Turn to unmask the mounts? When to shift from long-range 5-inch to the closer Bofors? Commanding officers rode the line between doctrine and gut feel, and VT made their good choices lethal faster. Because the fuse didn't need handset timing, crews no longer lost seconds to calculations that fell out of date as soon as an aircraft jinked. They could rake a corridor of air, shift a few degrees, rake the next. The guns weren't firing at planes anymore. They were firing at the future position of planes, confident that the shells themselves would correct the last few yards of error. At 0744, the destroyer that would become legend, USS Laffey, faced the most intimate form of the storm. 22 attackers in 80 minutes. If you need a yardstick for what a proximity fuse meant in human time, count it out loud. Every 4 minutes, another machine and another man came down a track, expressly to die on your deck and to take you with him. Laffey's crew sent 5-inch round after 5-inch round out on magnetic rails of habit. Load, slam, fire. Load, slam, fire. 345 VT shells left her guns during that window. 9. Inbound aircraft died to those bursts before they ever became leakers to be finished by the close-in guns. 6 kamikazes still managed to smack into her, and 4 bombs still found their marks because nothing turns combat into zero. But the ship lived, bleeding smoke and flame and salt water, because the proximity fuse had stripped most of the lethality out of the stream before it touched paint. That distinction, attrition at distance versus heroics at the rail, is the quiet thesis of the day. Without VT, Fleet commanders had to live with a horrible trade. Close range meant better accuracy, but close range also meant you were already being hit. VT moved the kill zone outward and multiplied the number of lethal moments each inbound had to survive. Its simple probability disguised as thunder. If a kamikaze once needed to run the gauntlet of a dozen meaningfully accurate bursts to give himself a fighting chance, now he had to survive dozens more, at ranges where a pilot's nerves were elastic and his eyes lied about speed and distance. He died in the air he thought was safe. For the men doing the work, all of this was tactile, not theoretical, the spray of hot brass underfoot. The strings of orders burned into brainstem. Commence firing. Shift target right 3. Cease. The butter, smelling stink of powder gas. The way a VT burst lit the inside of a cloud from within, like a lantern in fog, and then you saw the silhouette of a wing fall out of that lantern. Gunners stopped thinking in terms of hits and misses. They spoke instead about lanes, making lanes, closing lanes, turning the sky into a grid of don'ts that no airplane could trespass without being shredded. The effect on doctrine was immediate, even if the manuals took months to catch up. Radar pickets still died. Nothing at Okinawa was safe, but survivability rose in the ugliest neighborhoods of the map. Destroyer skippers started to trust long-range engagements because the first salvos no longer felt ceremonial. Gunnery officers adjusted ammunition outfits, so VT rounds dominated the ready racks. Task force commanders layered their defenses with new confidence. Cap fighters forward, yes, but with the knowledge that if the cap missed, the pickets weren't just alarms, they were scythes. This changed the message traffic in the small hours after the battle, too. Reports began to show kamikaze hit rates bending downward into single digits as VT presence saturated ships' magazines. The phrase "wall of steel" migrated from metaphor to math. On the other side of the fight, confusion thickened. Japanese aircrews wrote about flying through explosive air, about detonations that seemed to seek them rather than greet them. Rumors hardened into wrong theories, magnetic fields tugging at engines, invisible wires, heat-seeking fuses, even divine intervention inverted American shells that sensed the spirit of an approaching attack. The actual mechanism, tiny radios waking up mid-flight, wasn't a secret, the way a single blueprint is a secret. It was a secret the way an ecosystem is, guarded by procedures, by the rule to fire over water only, by an industrial sprawl that could afford to burn captured evidence and make more. The Japanese never secured an intact fuse in time to matter. They were trying to outfly a decision that happened inside the shell. There's a photograph from that spring that renders the whole idea in a single frame. The camera catches a 0 at masthead height, a blur of motion against a stack of black bursts stepping diagonally through the air like a staircase made of thunderheads. You can almost draw the line the pilot wants over the waves, pull up hard, smack into a grey deck, and you can see the line the fuses have already drawn, which is not a line at all, but a volume, a zone of no. That is the story of Okinawa in miniature, courage, speed, and commitment, meeting a technology designed specifically to cancel courage, speed, and commitment. By late afternoon, the sea wore the results. Oil slicks pooled in prisms, rafts bobbed, a few ships smoked, many steamed on, and the pickets, those thin, abused shields, counted survivors and fallen. The radios calmed, the scopes went back to points. In the quiet, men tried to remember when the sky started exploding at the right times, and they reached for new words. They didn't need them. They needed more VT rounds. Tomorrow would come with another Kikusui. And the day after that, the only way to make sure most attackers would never touch an American ship again was to keep turning near misses into kills, over and over, at the edge of the map where the ocean first turns white with wake. This is the hinge of the war at sea in 1945. Not a single ship, not a single battle, a hinge you can hear in the spacing between salvos and see in the gaps where airplanes used to be. The Japanese never learned exactly why that hinge turned so suddenly against them. They only learned that it did. Strip away the code name and the misdirection and the classified wrappers, and the proximity fuse is elegantly simple. It's a small brain that knows when it is close enough to kill. Not on impact. Not at a preset time. Close enough. To do that trick in 1942 demanded three miracles at once: a radar small enough to fit inside a shell, a power source that didn't exist until the instant of launch, and a package strong enough to survive a gun's violence without becoming scrap metal before it had the chance to think. Start with the moment of birth. A 5-inch anti-aircraft gun spools a shell from 0 to muzzle velocity in a blink, shoving it through up to tens of thousands of gravities. The projectile spins at a rate that would rip most mechanical things into confetti. Ordinary batteries crush or leak or die under that abuse. Ordinary radio parts rattle themselves to death. The fuse's designers embraced the violence and made it useful. They built a reserve battery that was, in effect, asleep until the gun woke it. A sealed glass ampule of electrolyte sat inside the cell like a tiny vial. Setback. The violent shove down the barrel shattered the glass. Centrifugal force flung the liquid into the dry plates. Power. Instant. Fresh. Reliable. Only after launch. Power is nothing without a purpose. The proximity fuse's purpose begins with a question it asks the world. Do I hear myself coming back? The little oscillator in the nose radiates energy and listens for the echo. Any echo will do at first. You can sort the truth later. As the shell moves toward a target, the echo's frequency slides upward. A Doppler shift that encodes a simple reality. Range is closing. Filters inside the fuse aren't trying to solve a calculus problem. They're looking for a heartbeat, a beat frequency produced by the difference between what the fuse sends and what it hears return. When that beat hits the right tempo fast enough to say, "You are in my bubble," a switch closes, the detonator fires, and the bursting charge turns to fragments moving faster than any pilot can will his airplane to change course. That bubble is the fulcrum of the whole idea. In a 5-inch shell, you can think in easy numbers. A lethal radius on the order of 70 feet, where an intact plane becomes a broken one. Shards of steel still angry and decisive for another 100 yards. A burst height that matters because gravity will carry fragments down through thin wings and fabric control surfaces, even if the shell detonates a hair high. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be close. And unlike the old, exquisite ritual of time fuse setting spinning tiny dials to match a guess about future range VT carries its own ruler and clock. Arming is the part you don't see but every sailor trusts with his life. You cannot have shells that wake too soon. The proximity fuse's safeguards read like an engineer's paranoia checklist. Until the shell leaves the barrel and spins, centrifugal switches refuse to close circuits. Until a sliver of time passes measured in fractions of a second sensitivity stays deliberately low. Only after both conditions are true does the fuse become fully awake, ears open, trigger primed. That way, a near-barrel burst doesn't pepper your own mount with fragments and ruin your day before it starts. All of this happens automatically, invisibly, with no action required from the crew beyond loading the right shell. Miniaturizing the radio was a second war, fought inside glass and metal. Vacuum tubes, the beating hearts of 1,930 seconds and early 1,940 seconds electronics, were fragile in peacetime. Inside a shell, they had to shrug off launch and then behave like instruments. The solution looked like a magic trick performed with pliers and patience. Tiny tubes with filaments literally restrained so they didn't snap under setback, mechanical bracing that snapped free in flight, solder joints used sparingly, but in the right places, coils wound to resonate where designers wanted, not where the laws of convenience put them. Imagine stuffing a cathedral organ into a coffee can and expecting the hymn to sound right after you've thrown the can off a cliff. That was the design problem. They solved it by brutal testing. Fire, recover fragments, analyze what died, and fix that precise failure mode, again and again, until the coffee can sang. The antenna had to be both something and nothing. Visible to radio, invisible to airflow, untroubled by the shell's spin. The answers weren't elegant to look at. They were pragmatic, conical elements. slots, shapes that fit the projectile's curve, so nothing disturbed the ballistic coefficient more than necessary. Because here's the non-obvious truth. VT doesn't just have to work as a radio, it has to fly as a shell. If the fuse drags, if it wobbles, you won't get it near the plane in the first place. The better the aerodynamics, the more often the radio even gets a vote. From the deck-edge perspective, the genius of VT wasn't just in the physics. It was in how little it asked of men already overloaded by noise and terror. Crews didn't have to calculate. They didn't have to touch dials while their ears rang. The mount captain called range and bearing because that's what humans know to do. The radar talker corrected. The trainer and pointer kept the reticle where the officer wanted it, and the fuse did its work without being begged. That is why the cadence of fire changed. Mountains of training drilled in a choreography designed to make mechanical time fuses good enough. VT freed that choreography from its fussiest steps. The seconds you no longer spent trimming fuse settings became rounds in the air, more rounds earlier, better placed. Modern eyes want software and acronyms. 1,945 offered glass and copper and sweat. But every part of this device looks modern because it embodies the ideas people now wrap in buzzwords. It's a smart sensor at the edge, making a decision locally to reduce latency. It's distributed autonomy, no central brain needed, millions of tiny ones instead. It's resilient by design. If one fuse fails, the next round doesn't care. Redundancy lives in the rate of fire. It's secure by policy. Use over water only, never where a dud can be scooped up on land. If a shell falls short, it sinks with its secret intact. And it's scalable, built not in a cottage lab, but across an industrial archipelago of companies, many of them learning hard new tricks in months because the war would not wait for perfect craftsmanship. Put this secret in the nose back into the sky over Okinawa, and you can feel why kamikaze math collapsed. A pilot screaming in at masthead height has one real weapon, the singularity of his will married to a blade of speed. He must thread a tiny needle at the end, over steel that is shooting back, through tracers that look slower than they are. Give the defenders a fuse that detonates when close enough becomes inevitable, and you have multiplied his problems into something even courage can't solve. He now needs to survive not one sweet spot, but a whole volume of death that shimmers in front of him and moves with him. Some did, many did not. In aggregate, at fleet scale, in ship's logs and after-action graphs, that difference becomes the headline. The overwhelming majority of suicide attackers never land a hit once proximity fuses saturate the magazines. There is another, quieter truth tucked in the engineering. The device honored the people who had to use it. It refused to make them slower. It did not ask for more hands. It did not insult their instincts. It rode their aim and improved it. That's why the first time a gun crew watched a VT round blossom 60 feet off a plane and still tear it apart, they became evangelists. The human eye is not built to pass Doppler or beat frequencies, but it is exquisitely good at recognizing when a thing that used to be impossible just happened right in front of it. Word spread the way real secrets do in war inside compartments, on mess decks. In the story, a loader tells a lookout because he needs to say it out loud to believe it. On paper, the proximity fuse is made of vacuum, glass, copper, steel, and plastic. In practice, it is made of time, seconds stolen back from calculations, seconds given to shooters, seconds denied to pilots intent on dying well. That is the secret in the nose cone. Not just a radar, a way to make time take sides. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation was bled white. Pilots with years in type were gone. Fuel was scarce. Factories still stamped out airframes, but the trained hands to fly them were dwindling. Every chart in every staff room told the same story. Conventional attacks were buying fewer results at a higher cost, and yet the sea lanes still mattered, the islands still mattered, and the great grey rectangles of American carriers refused to burn and sink on schedule. That's when desperation hardened into doctrine. The logic behind the kamikaze was, in its own terrible way, lucid. If you can no longer outfly the enemy or outlast him in a duel of fighters and bombers, you can still turn the airplane into a guided warhead. Skip the long training pipeline. Cut the mission profile to the bare minimum. Navigate to a convoy or task force, descend to masthead height, sprint through the flak corridor, and drive metal into metal. Your weapon becomes the certainty of impact if even a tiny fraction of the stream gets through. In the Philippines, first encounters with this method shocked American crews. Hit rates spiked. The time from detection to damage shortened. Ships that would have shrugged off near misses were being smashed by deliberate impact. From a staff officer's perspective in Kyushu, the math looked promising. If 1 in 3 or even 1 in 4 attackers could achieve a hit or damaging near miss, then mass matters more than finesse. Build larger waves. Stack sorties until the sky is thick enough to break the defender's aim. Exploit weather. Approach under the Sunday creep in under radar if you can. And most important, teach pilots to commit once they cross the horizon, no weaving to save themselves, no pullouts, no reconsideration. Replace survivability with reliability, because the reliability of impact is the only thing you can mass-produce quickly. This was not medieval mysticism. It was operations research written in blood. Target selection focused on pickets and carriers. Pilots learned the geometry of a ship's defensive arcs, how a destroyer turns to unmask guns, how a carrier throws a wake when the helm goes over hard, how a cruiser's superstructure gives the illusion of size, while the real target is the crowded flight deck just behind the island. Tactics evolved quickly. Low-level wave hopping to resist radar, then a pop-up in the last seconds to crash through the upper works or flight deck, or the opposite hold low and knife straight for the hull to start fires at the waterline and flood compartments with fuel and air. There was doctrine behind the moral theatre too. Mass attacks were named and scheduled. Kikusui floating chrysanthemums were not random swarms, but planned hammer blows. Pilots were drilled in timing rather than dogfighting. Formation discipline mattered less than arriving in a clotted window where defenders had too many targets and too little time. If a pilot survived long enough to see the ship's wake, he'd aim for the base of the island or the flight deck forward of the arresting wires somewhere with both people and planes. It is difficult to write about this without sentiment, but clarity demands it. From the Japanese side, this was not madness. It was a rational attempt to change the probabilities by spending courage for results. And for a time it worked. American logs filled with new kinds of damage. Deck parks burned. Bridges vanished under aluminum shrapnel and fuel. The rhythm of a carrier group changed because every launch and recovery cycle carried the additional risk that an inbound suicide plane would arrive right when your own fighters were circling low and slow, tanks light, brains on landing checks and not on interception. Radar pickets placed far forward to give warning started to look like sacrificial lambs. The men on those destroyers knew it. They still took station. That was the job. What the Japanese could not see, because it was hiding under the same mathematics they were trying to bend, was that the defenders were also changing the shape of the fight. The Americans were not merely improvising bravery, they were rewiring the sky. Fighter direction officers learned to vector combat air patrol with a chess player's calm and a boxer's timing. Radar ranges improved, and crucially, magazines filled with a different kind of shell, one that would turn the attackers close enough into the defenders close enough. The kamikaze logic assumed that near misses wasted ammunition and bought attackers time to close. Proximity fuses turned near misses into certainties. This offset sits at the heart of why the kamikaze doctrine faded from terrifyingly effective to brutally costly. The attacker's advantage is the small frontal cross-section in a dive, the low-altitude approach that hid under radar lobes. The very fact that he didn't care about egress had once subtracted from the defender's accuracy. Now they started to multiply the defender's advantage. A pilot who stayed low offered a perfect horizon for proximity bursts to rake. A pilot who dove hard offered predictable closure rates, which meant the little Doppler brain in the fuse could make its decision at exactly the right instant. The more committed the attacker became, the more he flew into the mathematics the fuse preferred. There's another layer to the Japanese calculus that seldom gets airtime: industrial sustainability. You can redirect pilots to a new doctrine with a speech. You cannot conjure engines and fuel and spares with rhetoric. The Allies were strangling Japan's industrial arteries by 1945. Airframe production could be forced. Engine quality could not. Fuel quality could not. And radio sets that might have made coordination and timing tighter were unreliable or absent. The kamikaze doctrine asked its pilots to be bullets. The Empire could not always afford to give them reliable gunpowder. In the end, the doctrine's greatest strength, its ruthless simplicity, became the root of its failure once the defenders matched it with an equal and opposite simplicity, a fuse that killed by being close enough. Before, the attackers exploited a seam between human perception and mechanical precision. After, that seam closed, the self-destructing courage of the pilots remained constant. The outcomes did not. At Okinawa, where the numbers were biggest and the days longest, the bent curves tell the story in a hard, unemotional way. As the proximity fuse saturated the magazines of ships on the picket line and inside the screen, the fraction of attackers that reached a hull collapsed. What had seemed like a grim new law of naval war: if they come in large enough numbers, they will hit, became a gamble with worse and worse odds. The Japanese never truly understood this in time to adapt. They saw and felt the results: explosions that seemed to seek them, black blossoms at heights and distances that made no sense, and devised counter-theories that did not map to the reality hidden inside the American shells. Doctrine that had been built to exploit predictability was suddenly facing a weapon that turned unpredictability into a feature. The pilots kept choosing death. The defenders made that choice matter less and less. That was the desperate calculus undone. Wall of steel isn't metaphor anymore once you've watched a proximity, fused barrage grow in the air. It comes in layers like steps you climb if you're a pilot coming in at 280 knots, and each step is a sphere of fragments waiting for your wings. The wall begins far out, at ranges where the mind wants to believe you're safe. It moves steadily inward until the last yards in front of a ship are simply not survivable without luck, so violent it feels like myth. The first layer stands at the outer edge of effective, heavy AA fire, 10 or 12,000 yards, when mount, ship motion, and radar guidance cooperate. To a pilot, the shells that detonate out there look harmlessly distant. They aren't. At that range, a near miss that would once throw useless soot into the sky now produces shrapnel at angles that catch an airframe in its most fragile planes. Thin wing skins, fuel lines, control surfaces. You may fly through the burst and feel nothing for a beat, and then the elevator stops, answering, or the engine sputters, or the canopy darkens with oil. Many aircraft die out there with no theatrics at all. They simply lose coherence, roll, and vanish into the sea without a photogenic fireball. That's the wall doing its work, while men on ships 2 horizons away never even see the splash. Closer in, the wall thickens. Mid-range barrages 5 to 8,000 yards start to stitch the sky, with a geometry your eye can follow. The proximity burst forms a sphere, but the gunners create a pattern, a lane of detonations along the line of approach. They're not guessing, they're using rate of closure tables and radar plots to paint volumes rather than points. A pilot who once relied on jinking at the last second now discovers that his jinx only thread him into someone else's heartbeat of a fuse. He leaves a contrail of bad luck. The ground tumbles in his sight. The ship that was a straight line across his windshield is now a figure fixed behind a blur of black blooms that seem to be where he is about to be, not where he is. By the time a plane is inside 3,000 yards, the wall becomes a pounding chorus. The big guns still throw VT, but the mid-caliber Bofors begin to dominate, and even without VT, their fire benefits from the chaos VT has already created. Damaged attackers hit this inner shell of defense, ragged and late, easier to finish at close range. The proximity bursts have pared away speed and control. It is common, in this last zone, to see a kamikaze that might have scored a lethal hit in 1944 now clip a mast or a crane and tumble into the water yards shy of the hull. It looks like a miss earned by nerves and luck. It's actually the earlier layers of the wall writing the epilogue. Night amplifies the effect. Before VT, night favored the attacker. Even with radar, the last-second math of time fuses under darkness, and low cloud often meant firing at ghosts. Proximity changed the equation by delegating the last inches of judgment to the shell itself. A black splash of burst against a darker sky makes a terrible kind of sense when it is reliably placed. Night pickets that once took their stations like condemned men began to believe they might live to see the sun, not because their courage grew, but because their tools did. You can track this change not only in ship logs and action reports, but in the way men recount their nights on watch. Fewer stories about praying through blind salvos, more about adjusting lanes, shifting fire, and watching silhouettes fall out of black clouds that had just flashed from within. If you want to understand how a wall materializes without the poetry, look at the arithmetic of rounds per kill. Mechanical time fuses could be surgical in a textbook. In practice, they punished the slightest error. Misjudge range by a hair, fail to account for a jink, let a wind gust nudge a shell's path, and your burst becomes theatrical but useless. That's how you end up firing over 1,000 rounds for a single downed attacker when fatigue, weather, and terror conspire. VT collapses these errors. It doesn't punish imprecision, it absorbs it. Gunners describe the emotional shift in simple language. More shots that feel like they count. At fleet scale, that feeling is a statistic. When an average engagement's heavy AA expenditure per kill drops toward a few hundred rounds, you are laying down a wall faster than the attackers can find holes in it. Doctrine followed. Gunnery officers moved proximity-fused rounds from exotic to default. Magazines reorganized their ready-use lockers so that when the order came to commence firing, the first hose of steel carried ears in its nose. Directors refined their patterns. Rather than trying to chase individual pips in a frantic game of tag, they laid belts of bursts along likely approach vectors and let the fuses do the fine-tuning. Fighter direction officers, watching the same radar scopes, could commit cap, differently less panic about the perfect intercept, more confidence that the wall would punish leakers. Carriers rethought deck cycles. Pickets adjusted their zigzags to keep the barrage lanes optimal, rather than merely evasive. There is also a physical truth about walls that proximity fuses exploited ruthlessly. Altitude. The low-level approach, a classic kamikaze geometry used to tuck attackers under radar and shorten the defender's aiming window. VT inverted that advantage. A low flyer has little vertical room to play with. A burst slightly high is still high enough to rain fragments through the canopy and wing. A burst slightly low pulls splinters along the water where props and radiators are vulnerable. In practice, you see more attackers shedding parts, bits of flaps, cowls, ailerons, long before they reach weapon release or impact geometry. The last mile gets longer and longer for the attacker. For the defender, it becomes a series of reliable choices. And then there is the human layer that rarely makes it into the diagrams. A wall is not conjured by devices alone. It is built by crews whose confidence climbs each time the sky blooms at the right moment. Confidence matters because it lengthens your attention span and steadies your hands. It sharpens your willingness to make aggressive range changes without fear of wasting ammunition. It encourages the next relay of loaders to go faster, the pointer to hold a hair longer, the talker to transmit bearings with calm precision instead of a shout. Technology created the possibility of a wall. Belief allowed men to raise it high enough to matter. The wall did not make ships invulnerable. Laffey burned and bled. Others sank. Even at the height of VT saturation, a lucky, skilled, or simply unbroken attacker could still thread the space between bursts and land a killing hit. But the point of a wall is not perfection. It is percentage. The wall of steel shoved the entire distribution of outcomes toward survival. Fewer hits per wave, fewer fires that matter. More days where a wounded destroyer limps home instead of rolling over and vanishing under an oil-slick rainbow. Multiply that by the weeks of Okinawa and the arithmetic becomes destiny. The wall did not end attacks. It ended the attackers' belief that mass alone could guarantee results. The 6th of April 1945. The first, Kikusui. The name sounds gentle until you stand on a picket's deck and watch the sea's horizon braid itself with smoke. The plan from the Japanese side was straightforward. A hammer blow from multiple directions. Kamikazes threaded with escorts and conventional bombers, all aimed to arrive inside a murderous half-hour window that would saturate fighter cover and choke the gun crews. The Americans answered with rings. Fighters far out, pickets further in, screens behind them, carriers, battleships, cruisers at the core. Between those rings lay the truth of whether the plan would work or fail. Dawn broke, undecided. Weather slouched low. The first plots on radar looked like a smear rather than a count. A picket line of destroyers and destroyer escorts, some reinforced with smaller ships, sat in lonely boxes far ahead of everyone else. They were the eyes and the shield, which is a polite way to say they were bait with agency. Communications crackled as fighter direction officers turned vectoring into a dance. Cap flights sent outward, then shifted again as the big smear resolved into multiple thrusts. Every minute shaved from the intercept remained a minute gunners would not have to buy with steel. But the mass was real. Too real. Intercepts bled off numbers, not intent. Shortly after 0600, the pickets began to fire. At that range, the sky feels clean and the burners smell cold. It only takes a minute to change that. The first proximity-fused salvos reached out and wrote punctuation in black. Where you had once seen fireworks, you now saw geometry. Attacks that would have reached a knife fight range in the Philippines lost parts and nerve far out. Waves that had been briefed to thread the last miles in good order frayed. Even so, swarms formed. The wind carried the chain smoke of bursts, and the atomized colors of aircraft paint down over the water like an ugly kind of confetti. You can picture the engagement as a series of gates. Gate 1 is radar. The pickets called the count. Gate 2 is fighters. They smashed what they could and herded, but herding a suicide pilot is like herding a lit match. Gate 3 is heavy AA. That is where the proximity fuse made itself known with a voice of its own. It changed not only how many attackers died, but when they died farther out of sight of the men who would otherwise have to pick burning metal out of their skin. Laffy's station that morning turned into a seminar in endurance. 22 attackers made for her in less than 90 minutes. The numbers are terrible and useful. She fired hundreds of 5-inch rounds with VT, scoring 9 kills with the big guns alone before the leakers crossed into the orbit of the Bofors and Oerlikons. 6 kamikazes hit her. 4 bombs struck home. Fires lifted off every deck edge. Men did the work that keeps steel from dying hoses, boundary cooling, shoring, the 1,000 small courages of staying where the smoke is thickest because someone has to. You will sometimes hear the phrase, "The ship wouldn't die," as if it's a myth. It is not. It is a ledger entry. VT had paired the wave. Damage control did the rest. Other pickets wrote other stories in the log that day. Some caught the edge of a thrust and bared their teeth but took little damage. Others endured longer beatings and bled for it. What unites these accounts is the shape of the air fight. Heavier fire earlier meant attackers arrived at close range in 1s and 2s, sloppier and more damaged. The tight, well-briefed terminal runs of earlier months became improvisations shaped by fear, smoke, and loss of control. The wall of steel did not just kill airplanes. It ruined the coherence of those that survived long enough to try to kill ships. Inside the screen, the wall bought time for carriers to launch and recover with fewer crises. The greatest fear of a flat-top captain was the kamikaze that arrives at exactly the wrong point in a deck cycle when planes are stacked in the groove, low and slow, when fuel hoses lie like veins across the deck, when a single impact can turn a useful ship into a drifting torch. On April 6, the number of wrong-moment arrivals fell. Not to zero, never to zero, but enough to keep task groups functioning inside a storm designed to stagger them. The first Kikusui taught both sides quickly. For the Japanese, the lesson was that courage and mass could still score. You could still hurt the enemy, but the cost was rising into the absurd. For the Americans, the lesson was that the outer ring mattered more than pride had once admitted. Destroyers and their escorts were not merely alarms, they were the decisive edge of survival. Magazines had to stay fat with VT. Logistics groups had to keep those shells flowing. Fighter direction had to keep the pickets from being left alone for even a minute longer than necessary. By midnight, the sea wore the results of arithmetic. Oil glinted like bruises around wrecks. Survivors clung to rafts. Laffy and others smoked but made their way a few miles closer to friends with bigger pumps and more doctors. The count of downed attackers was large enough to matter. The number that had reached American decks was smaller than it would have been months earlier. Multiply this day by 9 more Kikusui, and the curve is clear. The mass attack remained brutal, but its promise of predictability, send enough and you will break them, was gone. The first trial by fire didn't end the doctrine. It ended its inevitability. If Laffy is the parable of endurance, Hadley is the parable of velocity, how quickly proximity fuses, well handled, can turn a sky from threat to debris. The date is the 11th of May, 1945. The place is the lonely geometry of a radar picket station off Okinawa, where the horizon always seems too close and the clocks run too fast. Hadley and her partner on station, the destroyer Evans, are about to be tested by a storm so dense it feels scripted. It is not. It is what happens when an enemy decides to make a point at any cost. The first plots on radar look like a smear. Then the smear becomes a quilt, then threads, then individual flights. Fighters go out. They make kills and they make dents. But there are too many tracks to erase. The geometry tightens. Hadley's guns are already thinking before the order comes. The men at the 5-inch mounts are not doing math in their heads. They are executing a rhythm learned under fire. Load VT, confirm, fire, track, adjust, fire, let the shells carry the ruler. The mount captains ride their crews like drummers, steady enough to avoid panic, urgent enough to avoid drift. The engagement becomes a cascade. Hadley's 5-inch guns put up belts of bursts at ranges where, months earlier, they would have been marking time while the real fight waited inside a few thousand yards. Now, the real fight starts out there. Attackers roll in low, counting on the old arithmetic of, you can't hit me until I'm already inside your skin. They discover the new arithmetic. You can be fatally injured by something you cannot see, miles before you reach the vivid part of your plan. Airplanes begin to fall out of the sky, in the ugly, quiet way that looks like a pilot giving up. He hasn't. He's simply lost the control authority needed to keep flying a machine designed for lift, not luck. What separates Hadley's day from so many others is how quickly competence compounds. A good first belt of VT rounds doesn't merely kill 2 or 3 airplanes. It disorders a dozen. Disordered attackers make worse choices. Worse choices put them into better lanes for the next belt of bursts. The cycle repeats with a tempo that feels unreasonable until you remember that the fuse has stolen the 3 most expensive commodities in anti-air warfare: time, precision, and attention. Hadley spends all 3 more freely than an enemy can afford. The numbers that emerge from the day feel like folklore and read like accounting. Dozens upon dozens of attackers try to break the station. Hadley alone is credited with scores of kills in the engagement, her guns smoking, her decks littered with the brass proof that every minute was paid for in labour. Evans, fighting alongside, is hardly idle. The 2 ships write a duet in steel. Proximity bursts reach into the approach lanes and pull planes apart before the Bofors have to get earnest. The close-in guns still speak often. The leakers that arrive look bad, scorched, crooked, late. Many die within sight of the bridge, collapsing into the sea with a final wing clap 100 yards short of the hull. It looks, on film, like mercy. It is exactly what you get when a wall is built far enough out that the last yards are governed by gravity and residue, not speed and will. Hadley does not escape unharmed. No picket does, not on a day like this. She takes hits, kamikazes, and bombs. Fires find their way into the places that matter, because that is what fire does. Men do what they have trained to do. Isolate, starve, smother, shore. The difference between a ship that survives and a ship that doesn't often collapses into a small set of variables that start with how many attackers got through at terminal velocity. On May 11, the answer is compared with the mass aimed at her surprisingly few. That delta is what proximity fuses by for damage control. You can save a ship from 3 holes where you could not have saved her from 9. After action notes tell the human side in clipped language. We fired 3 seconds explosion. That's not poetry. It's an engineering diary embedded in muscle memory, a loader whose hands don't quite stop shaking between salvos, a pointer who remembers not the taste of fear but the taste of cordite because he breathed it for an hour, a talker who repeats bearings until numbers lose their meaning, then keeps repeating them because the mount on the other end needs the cadence more than the digits. No one on Hadley sets a time fuse that day. No one gropes for a wrench because the closure rate changed by 5%. The fuse makes those problems small. The men make the results big. Strategically, Hadley's day closes the loop that began with the first combat use of VT back in 1943. What started as a promising lab trick has become a fleet habit. Logistics can keep the magazines full. Factories can keep the fuses cheap. Doctrine can assume their presence. The enemy cannot assume their absence. A destroyer on a forward station can shape the sky for miles in front of her, because each shell she throws is a tiny, patient sensor making a local decision on the defender's behalf. Smart did not arrive with silicon. It arrived with vacuum and glass. When the smoke drifts and the counts stabilize, you see the outcome in relief. The picket station holds. The task groups behind it continue their program of strikes and landings. The Japanese have spent men and machines at a rate they cannot sustain. The attacker's certainty that mass equals result has been eaten by a new certainty, that the air in front of an American hull will behave like a trap. The doctrine of deliberate self-destruction meets a weapon designed to make self-destruction strategically meaningless. Hadley limps home. Evans limps too. The ocean, indifferent, covers the traces. But in the radio shacks and plotting rooms and factory floors that fed this day, the lessons harden. Keep the outer ring strong, keep the fuses flowing. Treat the wall not as a miracle but as a maintenance item. The next wave will come, the next picket will need the same rhythm. Load, fire, 3 seconds, explosion. The phrase is brutal and precise. It is also the sound of a fleet teaching the sky to take its side. War at sea is a spreadsheet written with smoke. You don't win by a single miracle. You win when the columns bend. In the Philippines, the first suicide strikes brought shocking returns, roughly 1 in 3 attackers hitting or damaging. A doctrine was born from that fraction. But by the time the fleet closed on Okinawa, the same fraction was fading into single digits. Not because the attackers lost will, if anything, they leaned harder into it, but because the defenders changed the math where the math lives. In the air, on the way in, at ranges where nerves still believe in luck. The levers that moved the curve weren't romantic, they were dull in the best way. First, engagement range. The proximity fuse stretched the kill zone outward to 10 or 12,000 yards. That didn't just produce more opportunities to score, it produced earlier opportunities. Earlier means calm hands, cleaner director solutions, and fewer last-second errors. Second, rounds per kill. With mechanical time fuses, a typical 5-inch battery could burn through over 1,000 rounds for a single hard kill during messy, low-visibility attacks. With VT, that dropped into the low hundreds, call it to 300 on average in mixed conditions because near misses stopped being wasted poetry. Third, tempo. Gunners no longer fed the fight with range-setting rituals. They laid belts of bursts where an attacker was going, then immediately shifted to ruin the next lane. The weapon moved men out of arithmetic and into cadence. Fourth, distribution of fire. Because the fuse made close enough lethal, directors could afford to paint volumes rather than chase single pips. You're not gambling on the one perfect solution. You're investing in a field of good ones. Add up those levers at scale, and the picture changes everywhere you care about survival. Pickett's survivability bent upward first, because the pickets stood inside the worst weather of the sky. The number of attackers reaching their hulls at terminal speed fell. Ships still took hits, Okinawa chewed metal without pity, but the skew of the distribution moved. Fewer direct impacts, more near-hull splashdowns, more attacks arriving too damaged and too late. This is what single digits feels like when you're the one on station. Fewer moments where you see a cockpit at eye level, fewer minutes when you brace for fire to find you, more days when the ship limps, smokes, and lives. Ammo efficiency is the quiet twin of safety. When rounds per kill fall, you get to fire the difference somewhere useful. That surplus becomes indirectly more kills. Destroyers that once might have gone black on 5-inch ammunition before the worst of a wave passed now ended fights with shells still in the ready racks. Efficiency compounds. Your fifth belt of bursts exists because your first belt worked. The fighters overhead benefit too, because the outer ring's confidence lets controllers vector cap with less panic. Perfect. Intercepts are no longer the only way to survive. Good enough. Intercepts, backed by belts of VT bursts, become routine. The math also flipped the shape of damage. In the early days, a kamikaze wave arrived more intact at knife fight range. It landed body blows hits that created fires forward of the island, or smashed the waterline right where pumps and crews are hardest to mass. Later, waves arrived frayed. Leakers hit uglier, not smarter. They came in crooked, bleeding oil, shedding parts. They hit cranes, masts, and empty air 100 yards short. Damage control is a science of margins. A ship can carry 3 holes and live where the 4th would have killed her. VT didn't promise perfection. It delivered margins. Margins keep ships in formation, planes flying, schedules intact. Numbers on paper have a human translation, and it sounds like this. The voice on the TBS circuit gets slower. Bearing calls are measured, not frantic. A loader looks up between belts and realizes his hands aren't clawed into cramps because his brain believes, not hopes, that the lane he's feeding is eating the sky. The controller in the fighter direction shack stops talking in a shout and starts talking in sentences. When the curve bends, bodies remember before memos do. There's a second-order effect. Nobody writes on chalkboards, but everyone feels cognitive load. If every inbound is an urgent one, you drain human attention to fumes. VT spreads urgency across time. It makes most inbounds handled earlier, which frees attention for the freak event, the solitary leaker with a weird angle, the late pop-up hugging a squall, the pair that split a picket and try to bracket. Human brains recover seconds when belief replaces doubt. Those seconds become small. Crucial choices shift the barrage 5 mils, keep a ready rack topped, vector the reserve cap 2 minutes earlier. The doctrine that bet on mass took too long to notice that the house had changed the odds. Throwing more planes at a wall that grows with every round is not reinforcement. It is famine disguised as courage. That is the heart of less than 1 in 10. It is not a slogan. It is the brief, ruthless biography of what happens when self-aiming bursts meet self-destructing zeal at the last great battle line of the Pacific. And if you want the epigram in a single sailor's sentence, it's this. We used to pray for a miss. Now we expect a burst. Expectation is policy written in the nervous system. Once it sets, the spreadsheet follows. The columns bend and don't bend back. Sometimes a secret survives not because it is invisible, but because every clue points the wrong way. Japan never truly understood the fuse that was unmaking its doctrine. Pilots knew what they saw, black blossoms that appeared at unnatural distances and unkind heights, airplanes torn apart by what felt like air molecules deciding to hate them. Intelligence officers received reports full of metaphors and guesses, magnetic trickery, heat-seeking detonations, invisible wires, floating mines. The truth, tiny radios that woke mid-flight, listened, and decided never gelled into a tactical counter in time to matter. The Americans built that fog on purpose. Use over water rules were sacred. Fire VT at sea, not over land. If a shell fell short, it would sink with its secret intact. Enforced ruthlessly, the rule meant even spectacular barrages left little a salvage crew could show a lab. Salvage discipline was ferocious. Wrecks were patrolled, fragments were policed. If you must abandon a gun position with duds aboard, you don't. You burn it, flood it, or blow it. On the rare occasions a fuse could be handled by the enemy. It was a corpse, its tiny organs smeared by shock and sea. Then there was the name, VT Variable Time, a masterpiece of honest misdirection. Even if you hear the code, it points your mind toward the wrong tool, a better clock, not a radio ear. Japan understood mechanical time fuses. They had their own. They had ideas about proximity fuses too, but nothing their industry could field in weeks or months. Fuel was thin. Engines were fragile. Radios at squadron level were unreliable. The massive industrial choreography you need to make hundreds of thousands of delicate, rugged, identical mini-radars simply wasn't available in 1945. Even if the concept had been captured cleanly, countermeasures were cruelly limited. You can't ask a suicide pilot to carry a jammer and fly a precise profile to defeat a Doppler trigger. He is the jammer. He is the profile. His job is to commit and stop thinking. You can alter approach geometry on paper, shallower in, steeper down, keep the throttle surging to make a messy beat frequency, but the real air ruins neatness. Wind shear, haze, tracer, distraction, and a brain that narrows to a single bright target. The device is elegant because it exploits what an attacker cannot change: closure rate and closeness. Consider the feedback loop of wrong lessons. A squadron returns, ragged, some planes missing, others scorched, and the debrief collects hypotheses. Magnetic fuses? Then wrap a little asbestos near the engine, tape over intakes, add chaff to confuse radar. Results don't improve. The next guess: aerial mines strung invisible at approach altitudes. So try going higher, and then diving late. Now you spend longer in the outer belts of bursts and your loss rate worsens. Confirmation bias takes the wheel. Every failed tweak is chalked up to poor execution, not a broken hypothesis. Meanwhile, the defender's secret is not perfect knowledge. It is a technology that doesn't care which false theory you choose. It punishes all of them equally. There was a cultural barrier, too, on both sides. The American program trained workers to know only their piece. Compartmentalization protected the device from gossip. On the Japanese side, the moral gravity of the kamikaze narrative pulled attention away from mundane physics. When you valorize will to the point of doctrine, you risk starving the plain, boring questions. What is happening exactly? At what range? How does the burst pattern change with approach speed? The few analysts who wanted to quantify often lacked the instrumented data, and by the time reality intruded loss rates that could not be explained as weather or pilot error, the tempo of the campaign was already dictating behavior. There was barely enough fuel to train, let alone test countermeasures with rigor. Even espionage failed the clock. The proximity fuse wasn't a single blueprint waiting to be stolen. It was a process, a choreography of components, tolerances, and shop floor instincts. You could sketch a circuit. You could not sketch the muscle memory of a line worker who knows a good seal by the sound it makes when a jig clicks. Without the ecosystem, the secret is a rumor with screws. By the time whispers sharpened, by the time some officers started to concede that the Americans had a radio in the shell, logistics had already written the ending. Even a perfect description of the device would have done little without the supply chain to birth it at scale. The Americans had that chain. Japan did not. The Pacific is vast, and secrets drown quickly in it. The last pilots who died without knowing what lived in an American shell carried that ignorance to the bottom with them. The war ended before the secret needed to be shouted. That is how you hide a miracle in plain sight. And the final insult is conceptual. The kamikaze turns close enough into victory by making the airplane the fuse. The proximity fuse steals that magic and delivers it to the defender. Two doctrines that worship the same altar closeness met over the East China Sea. Only one of them could afford to be wrong about how closeness is measured. The one with radios in its shells. The nose cone miracle wasn't forged in a single lab. It was assembled by an archipelago of factories that learned to make glass, copper, steel, and vacuum behave like a choir. Picture the supply chain as a map of little lights. Radio tube plants, battery shops, precision machine works, loading depots, inspection rooms with women in smocks peering through magnifiers at parts smaller than a thumbnail. In peacetime, these firms built radio sets, toys, telephones. In wartime, they built a decision that lived inside an artillery shell. Scale came first. Scores of companies across more than 100 plants signed up to make parts that would only ever be known by a mark number. Output rose until fuses were measured by the tens of thousands per day, enough to feed 2 oceans and still stock the lockers on every ship headed west. The bottlenecks were not glamorous. A particular glass envelope. A thyratron switch that had to fire after surviving a gun's fist. A battery that must remain perfectly inert on the shelf until setback shattered a vial inside and spun electrolyte onto dry plates. Each bottleneck was studied and split and solved, not in white papers but in reamers and jigs, in training classes on night shifts, in test rigs that slammed prototype, fuses down steel throats again and again, until only the robust remained. Cost fell like a cliff. Early units rare, handheld, fussed over cost as much as small appliances. Once the dance was understood, once you could stage 10 operations in parallel and stitch them together with simple gauges and idiot-proof fixtures, unit price dropped from hundreds of dollars into the teens. Cheaper means more. More means you put them everywhere. When a shell becomes a commodity sensor, commanders stop hoarding it for special moments. They build their whole day around it. That is how doctrine changes, not by memo, but by the feel of a full locker that will be full again next week. Quality was religion. These were not peacetime radios. A tube that sang sweetly on a bench but shattered under 20,000 grams was a liar. Factories built new rituals for truth. Drop tests, spin tests, thermal soak, proofing lots on range fire. Every batch laced with sacrificial units fired and recovered from test areas, the fragments sifted for clues about failure modes invisible to the naked eye. Inspectors learned to fear a solder joint that looked too shiny, a coil that hummed at a frequency you couldn't hear but you could feel in your teeth. The result was not perfection, it was consistency. Consistency is the only currency that buys confidence on a gun mount. Idiot-proofing was not an insult. It was a love letter to the man under stress. Jigs designed so apart could only go in one way. Gauges that lied in only one direction toward safety. Color bands that told a loader which mark he held even when the paint smudged with sweat and cordite. If a fuse could be put together wrong at 3 a.m., it would be. So the factory made it so it couldn't be. That is how you translate cleverness into reliability. Secrecy lived in process, not posters. Workers knew the rules. Don't write it down. Don't talk about it. Don't guess what it does. Many genuinely didn't know. They didn't need to. You can manufacture a miracle as a series of tasks. Wind this, trim that, test, stamp, a box, without telling the person at station 12 that her hands are part of a device that will decide whether a destroyer burns or lives. The labs and the loading depots took on the burden of knowing. Everyone else took on the burden of excellence. That division of labor kept the secret whole. Logistics turned the miracle into a habit. Shells move badly, they are heavy, awkward, and impatient with rough handling. The fuse compounded that by demanding dry storage and careful packing until the moment it met the projectile. The answer was choreography. Keep the components apart until the last safe minute. Train loading crews to marry fuse and shell at a pace that looks theatrical until you've done it for a week and it feels like breathing. Put the right spares on the right ship so a blown lot number doesn't ruin a week of fighting. War is friction. Logistics is grease. Grease let the wall of steel stand up every dawn as if by magic. And then there were the people who turned tolerance stacks into survival. A line foreman who kills a batch because his nose says the seal isn't right. A young woman who can hear a bad oscillator through the whine of 10 good ones. A toolmaker who shaves a jig by a hair so a critical dimension lands inside a window that a chalkboard insisted was close enough. None of them ever saw Okinawa. All of them built it. When sailors later said, "The shells decided to burst at the perfect moment," what they really meant was that thousands of distant hands had decided, months earlier, not to accept anything less than a fuse that could be thrown off a cliff and still sing on the way down. You can measure victory in margins. A carrier that keeps its flight schedule because the picket lived. A convoy that doesn't scatter because the destroyer still has a rudder. A pilot who lands on a deck that didn't catch fire at noon. Each of those margins traces back along supply lines to a bench where someone made a part right enough to be boring. Boring wins wars. The proximity fuse is a device that turned boring into lethal. Factories do not win medals. They win margins. Margins add up to ships that return to port. Ships that return to port launch planes the next day. Planes the next day mean an island chain that keeps moving one step closer to the enemy's home. That is how you draw a straight line from a glass vial in a battery to a pilot, in a zero who never reaches a wake he intended to cut. Courage doesn't change physics. It negotiates with it. The kamikaze was a negotiation conducted at knife point, a demand that the universe pay a ship for the price of a man. In the Philippines, the universe sometimes agreed. By Okinawa, it mostly did not. The difference was not a sudden shortage of courage. It was a flood of computation in glass and copper, in training and choreography, that made the last mile of air in front of American hulls behave like a trap the human mind could not spring. The proximity fuse didn't make ships invulnerable, it made outcomes predictable. That is a colder kind of victory than the movies sell, and a better one. Predictability lets you plan strikes that launch on time. It lets you keep tankers and ammo ships alive long enough to matter. It lets a damaged destroyer limp home to fight again. It smooths the spikes of panic into bumps of procedure. Send the fighters here. Lay the belts there. Keep the magazines fed. Sleep 6 hours out of 24 because you trust the wall you and your friends built. It also rewrote doctrine, beyond 1945. When people talk about smart weapons, they picture silicon. The fuse proves the idea is older than that. Push decision-making to the edge. Let a tiny sensor act on local truth faster than any human can adjust. Build your system so that failure of a part doesn't cripple the whole. That's the Aegis philosophy in seed form. That's modern air defense layered, autonomous at the micro scale, coordinated at the macro scale. The war ended before anyone needed to say it out loud. But the lesson was obvious on the gun line. If a device can make close enough lethal, you don't need to chase perfection. You can buy victory with repetition. There's a moral afterimage to all this. The kamikaze doctrine bet that will could outbid machinery. It made a certain sense in 1944 because the machinery of the defense was still clumsy at the last second. But the fuse arms a quieter kind of will, the will to perfect a process until the average result cannot be budged by courage. That's not romantic. It is humane. The closer you move results toward predictability, the fewer men die pointlessly on days when the weather and luck should have decided otherwise. History will try to make it neat, this invention here, that battle there. But what actually happened is messier and more impressive. 1,000 small decisions, each unimpressive alone tightening a coil tolerance, inventing a battery that wakes only at launch, drilling a crew to swap fuses by muscle memory, teaching a controller to vector fighters in arcs instead of lines stacked until they became destiny. The kamikaze doctrine met a counter that wasn't louder or more dramatic. It was quieter, calmer, and utterly, brutally reliable. Picture the last minute of a wave that doesn't get written down. A picket's CIC smells like coffee and sweat. The radar scope is a pale moon with freckles that move. A talker repeats a bearing in a voice that sounds bored because he's trying to make boredom contagious. On deck, a loader's thumb is raw, and he will notice it later. Right now, he only notices the click that says the round seated and the door closed. The director calls a small correction. A belt of bursts appears in the middle distance like a row of black pearls along a string only the sky can see. A plane that was a threadbare streak becomes a smudge, then a scrap, then nothing, and the sea stitches itself around the gap. No cheer, no speech, just the next bearing. The legacy is practical. Armies and navies after 1945 learned to love sensors at the edge. Proximity fuses for artillery, radar, guided missiles, infrared seekers, fuses that can count rotations, shells that adjust course by listening to their own flight. Each is a descendant of the idea that a small, local brain beats a big, distant one when seconds are the currency. In that lineage, the VT fuse is a first word that still echoes. For Japan, the epitaph is harsh and human. An empire asked its youngest to be bullets. It was a choice born of scarcity and belief. It collided with an opponent who had the industrial stamina to turn laboratories into habits and habits into a climate. In that climate, even sacrifice loses leverage. The pilots kept coming. The fuses kept bursting. The curve kept bending toward lives saved on one side and lives spent on the other. There is no lyric line that makes that fair. There is only the record. Hit rates that sank into single digits, waves that dissolved outward, ships that bled and floated instead of bled and died. You can end the story on a picket deck just after a wave has passed. The sea is cruelly beautiful again. The air smells like rain and hot metal. Men sit with their backs against a warm gun house and count new holes in old paint. Someone laughs at nothing because the body needs to. Someone else writes a letter he will never mail because the mail won't go out for days and he needs a reason to keep his hands busy. On the bridge, a logbook records a few flat sentences about rounds fired, planes downed, hits taken, fires fought. Somewhere in those lines is the hinge of the war, the moment when the sky learned to side with the ship. There is a counterfactual people like to whisper, what if the fuse had leaked early? Suppose an intact VT round had splashed on a beach in the Philippines and found its way to a competent bench. Suppose a crash program had begun to jam or spoof. Would it have mattered? Maybe at the edges. A jammer could confuse a few shells. A doctrine could shift a few approach profiles. But the heart of the device, its ability to make close enough, lethal, does not rest on fragile tricks. It rests on geometry and the human inability to fly perfectly under fire. The counterfactual folds back into the same answer. The wall might have grown slower, but it would have grown. So the title writes itself in the end. They never knew, couldn't know in time what decided their fate. They saw only the effects. Air that exploded without touching them. Ships that refused to die at the expected rate. A war that went cold in the last mile where it should have been hottest. The proximity fuse changed nothing about courage and everything about results. Divine wind met human design. Resolve met a device that turned resolve into wreckage at a predictable distance. That is how a continent-sized ocean learned a new rule, and the Pacific War ended in the only place it could inside the quiet moment, when a shell wakes up, listens, decides, and blooms.